Beautiful. So I should say just first, thank you very much for inviting me here. I'm really looking forward to this. And if there's any kind of technical issues, there's stutter in the video or anything like that, probably easiest thing to do is just to drop it in the chat because that loads faster than the videos and things like that. And I've got the chat window open. You know how this goes. Um, but yeah, so thanks again for having me. I'm gonna talk about what you might very charitably call a supposed second digital revolution in art. In particular, I'm really interested in augmented and virtual reality. And I guess one of the things that's kind of been pitched relatively recently is in philosophy, there's a ton of different debates when we think about AR and VR and MR. So augmented, virtual, and mixed realities. More on what exactly those different things are in a little bit. But when we think about the debates for these things, there's ontological debates and epistemic debates. So, are virtual objects real? Are they really out there? Can we learn things from engaging in VR? These kinds of things. There's a whole slew of ethics debates, especially when it comes to AR about virtual nudges and just how prolific those could be and how they could be really subtly manipulating people. But of course, what we're interested in today is there's a ton of really cool aesthetics debates. And there's been a little bit less of this than there has about the ontology and the ethics, but there's some. And that's really what I want to do today. In particular, I want to focus on the idea of, we'll call it the aesthetic potential of augmented and virtual reality. And what I really mean by that is like, okay, do AR and VR let us do artistic things that we couldn't do before we had AR and VR? So I've kind of put these in terms of two questions. And these are the ones I really want to try and answer. The first one is like, are augmented and virtual reality merely remediation tools? Or do they actually engender genuinely novel art forms? Is there something we couldn't do without using AR and VR? And as you can sort of see in the little brackets there, I want to say yeah, but we'll come to it. The second question I'm really interested in is whether remediation into AR and VR already delivers novel art forms. And I want to say no there because otherwise the first question's really easy to answer. So I want to try and make it at least a little bit more, interesting. But yeah, in fact, what I'm going to try and do is tackle the questions in the opposite order. But more specifically, the plan is to start, there's a very long run up here. I should warn you of that. There's a very long run up where I want to talk to you about this kind of notion of digital aesthetics and the idea of the digital as a very broad kind of medium, remediating lots and lots, probably all traditional art forms. So I want to kind of run with that because it sets the stage then for the questions and talk about AR and VR in particular. So after kind of talking about this digital remediation, we'll turn to what I had a minute ago as question two, and this idea of AR and VR as remediation machines, and whether virtual remediation actually gives you novel art forms. And again, my aim here is to try and say no, that merely kind of instancing traditional art forms in VR or AR doesn't give you something genuinely new. It's more like the move from analog to digital photography than it is genuinely coming up with some novel kind of art category or something like this. After I've kind of hopefully convinced you of that, I then want to try and posit some actually genuinely novel virtual art forms. And I'm going to give you two, so one for VR and one for AR. Yeah, cool, Tim. I'll come to that. But really broadly, the idea is that we take a kind of media type that you might have in the sort of analytic world, or analytic, Jesus, I've been teaching analytic philosophy all day long. Analog world, there we go. The analog world, and then we kind of move it into another media type. So an easy instance is, right, digital photography remediates analog photography in that it recaptures the same artistic category, but using a different kind of medium. We'll talk about that again in a little bit more detail in a minute, but that's the basic idea. So again, coming back, I'm going to try in section 3 to convince you that there's at least 2 novel virtual art forms. And then in all good analytic philosophy tradition, I'm going to immediately say, oh, but I could well be wrong there, and raise an objection. And I have to confess, depending on which way the wind is blowing, I'm convinced that the objection is actually really substantive and that maybe it's not that big a deal after all. So I'm very curious to see what people's response to it is. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about where we go from here and what this discussion suggests about digital remediation, virtual remediation, and the idea of novel art forms. So that's the rough and ready plan. Let's get started with this first kind of section talking about digital aesthetics and this general broad idea of digital remediation. So, unsurprising, really boring start, but digital technologies seem to be really impacting a bunch of aesthetics debates. They arguably impact debates about what is art, though I have to confess that's a debate I think maybe isn't super interesting. They certainly raised a bunch of difficulties for thinking about who counts or even what counts as a co-artist or a contributing artist. They highlight a bunch of major difficulties in how to think about art curation. So there's a very fun thing here about curating video games or curating web art and whether you need to kind of keep it on the original hardware or not. And arguably, they raise some new fascinating twists on the nature of artwork appreciation. So cool. And I'm not sure this isn't playing, but this is worth seeing. This is a lovely, lovely augmented reality kind of version of Magic the Gathering, where you've got your little monsters that pop up, and then as you play the game, they like actually fight each other. It's very cool. It's terrible to play because you have to wear the goggles while you're playing, but you know, or look through your phone, which is just as bad. But okay, so digital technology is impacting a bunch of these aesthetic debates, and how's it doing that? Well, broadly by this kind of rise in what we'll call digital art. And here I'm just going to liberally steal from Catherine Thompson Jones. I'm going to call digital art art that essentially relies on computer-based digital encoding, right? And notably, this kind of digital encoding can occur at different levels or in different sorts of ways. You can see this with 3 artworks that she talks about that, again, I'm just going to steal. So we have one here, which is Cree Bruns's Stills in Flux, which originally was a sequence of analog photographs that was then run through a digital kind of smearing program to give you this very cool kind of blur. It looks a little better if it's not completely pixelated from my screen capture, but so that's one where effectively it was an analog production process that was then run through a kind of digital display, as it were. You can also get it with Julian Oppy's landscape films, which are somewhere in between paintings and films. Basically, they're animated GIFs, but you know, if we call them that, art galleries don't want to display them. So they're encoded, they're required to be kind of digitally displayed because they involve this sort of change in motion. And then finally, we have John F. Simon Jr.'s Window, which is kind of digital all the way up and down. So Simon wrote this program. It's actually a really simple program where it constantly generates rectangles that bounce up through the screen. But he also wrote it on a laptop that he had effectively deconstructed. So he basically took the laptop, folded it in half the wrong way, then embedded the whole thing in this lovely like plexiglass frame. And the work is the whole like the computer that's been partially broken and reprogrammed, the visual effect that's coming on the screen, and in fact the framing. So it's a kind of neat case where it's literally digital both at the level of creation and partially digital and partially physical at the level of presentation. But again, this is just kind of highlighting different stages that the kind of digital can get in. either at the art making process or at the kind of art, if you like, displaying process. So all of these works are digital in virtue of the technology with which they're produced and or presented. Right? Thompson-Jones sometimes talks as if she thinks like mere digital presentation is sufficient to make a work digital. I'm going to run with it, but whatever. I worry about that because that suggests just like a picture of a painting on my phone would count as like a digital work. I'm not so sure, but why does all of this matter? Well, it matters because basically for any artwork, appreciation begins with the recognition that it's a work, right? That the thing that we're engaging with is a product of some kind of maybe artistic, but whatever activity, and making this object something that's meant to be appreciated as an achievement. It can be a very poor achievement. Bad art is still art, right? But it's some kind of achievement. And this is typically understood in terms of the aesthetically significant effects achieved by the artist, and we pay attention to the kind of tools and capacities and things that they had available. In some sense, and this is, I'm talking to a room full of, virtual room full of estheticians. So really, right, sometimes you need to recognize the kind of choices and the significance of the choices available to the artist. Very simple case, if you're looking at a chainsaw sculpture and it's got really delicate feathering on like a bird, that's much more impressive in a kind of way than if it was made by hand with a very careful like chisel and file. So again, this is something that I think everyone here is going to know, right? Basically thinking about the kinds of options available to the artist should impact our appreciation of the work. Put really bluntly, this suggests that the ontology of a work can impact how we appreciate it. And this is often called kind of medium-based aesthetic appreciation. We pay attention literally to the format and the media that the work is an instance of, and that's going to impact how we appreciate it. And note here, when I'm talking about medium, I don't mean medium as material, or you can mean medium as material, but I'm more interested in medium as kind of type or category or kind. So what I have in mind here is like, look, here's 3 different instances of the same medium, right? They're all kinds of painting, but they involve different materials. So there's oil painting, there's watercolor painting, and there's digital painting. And when I'm going to talk about remediation, it's almost always going to be in terms of this notion of type or kind or art category. And not so much material, because if it's the material, well then cool. Remediation turns out to be almost impossible. It'll be certain kinds, but at least the kinds that we're after with things like digital remediation would be impossible. And really, I guess what I'm after is something like a kind of Walton notion of categories of art, where the ontological options available to the artist are going to impact the kinds of category, genre, type, kind the work is an instance of. And what category, type, kind the work is an instance of will then in turn impact our aesthetic appreciation. It'll fix things like the standard, contra-standard, and variable features, or those will at least be broadly construed fixed. So put in another way, what I'm after, at least with this first part, is something really easy. So here's a picture of my friend Meha. I took this picture in London. This was just before one of our friends' weddings, and I thought it was really nice. It's a nice picture, right? But as Catherine Thompson-Jones says, right, if you were to learn that this image, despite how it looks, was produced and screened digitally, set aside the screened, given how we're doing this, right, would you, or would we, and should we appreciate the image differently? And of course, the follow-up is that this is not at all a picture of my friend Meha. This is a product from one of my favorite Twitter bots called This Person Doesn't Exist, which has been around since, I want to say 2013, kind of putting out these steadily getting better and better and better at making just fake portraits. Um, and I think if you like how you think about the image changed, whether you want to think about it as a picture of my friend that I took or as the product of this Twitter bot making these portraits, you've already got the point I'm after. So, right, it looks like this sort of medium-based appreciation kicks in. And when we start thinking about digital tools, that should really radically impact our range or how we aesthetically appreciate a given work. Why? Because digital tools radically expand artists' range of options and they radically increase ease of use. It becomes much, much, much easier to get something to look exactly the way that you want it. The easiest instance of this is if you think about film editing. Digital film editing is infinitely easier than analog film editing because you don't have anything like actually cutting film or messing around with a physical object. Instead, if you screw up, you just Control Z and go back. So how the thing, I should say Z, I should say Z. Sorry, forget the audience I'm talking to here, right? um, but what does this mean? Well, it suggests that at least in some ways, you might think that it kind of increases the aesthetic, we'll call it value, or at least in the sense that how something looks now becomes much closer or potentially closer to the artist vision or what was intended. Exactly how it looks is exactly how it should look, in some sense of should. And of course, there's also a flip side to that, right? If the range of options and ease of use is increased so much, well, then anybody could have done it, right? There's a sense in which the artistic skill and quality kind of go away, at least in some broad sense. Right? As Dom Lopes says, right, if artistry requires creative skill and making art with computers involves little or no creative skill, well, cool, there's not much artistry here, is there? It's worth noting Lopes is making this before he goes on to defend computer art, but it's a nice point, and I think it has some bite. But again, what matters for our purposes here is that this digital stuff, right, remediating into the digital gives creators a huge range of new options and much, much easier kind of applications of these options. And so that can impact or should impact how we appreciate given works look, or just how we appreciate how these works are. And to go along with this sort of broad digital aesthetics thing, there's also a notion of digital remediation. So this comes back to Tim's question. Because these digital tools are so powerful and flexible, they're going to allow for us to remediate probably all, maybe not all, but I'm certainly most traditional analog mediums. And again, here, what's remediation? Well, just to steal directly from Dom Lopes, it's a kind of borrowing where one medium is itself incorporated or represented in another. So digital painting remediates traditional painting by giving us a way to kind of effectively ersatz paint. Digital photography remediates analog film photography, etc. Note again here when we're thinking of the medium, it's not the material, but it's in this sense of medium as category or type. Notably, many of these remediations will modify the type in some slight way. An easy instance, digital painting has a problem with sort of feedback. You don't really have this sort of push on the surface most of the time. And that really throws a bunch of people off when they're trying to do digital painting for the first time. But it's still something like the same kind of activity, and the works are still going to be broadly in the same category. So, put another way, these new works, these digital works, aren't going to be new, at least not new kinds. They're going to be subtypes of the kinds we're already familiar with. As Dom says, they're old wine in new bottles. It's still painting, it's just digital painting. It's still photography, it's just digital photography. It's still film, it's just not on film anymore. Right? That kind of thing. But it also seems like the digital does support novel art forms. Video games look like something we couldn't have in an analog world, at least not in the same kind of way. Um, Lopes talks about his notion of interactive computer art. And arguably, Simon Jr.'s window is something like this, so algorithmic art might be a case. I'm happy to kind of, if people disagree with these examples, we can, push for other ones. Harold Cohen's work seems to be a kind of case here. Um, but there might be more, there might be fewer. It seems to at least appear to offer new art forms. So that's, again, I told you, a massive run up. Now we can finally get to actually talking about VR and AR. But it's important to have all of that in the background because much of what we want to say about AR and VR is going to kind of be inherited from all of that stuff we just did. So, on to virtual remediation. So, what do I mean by VR? Well, VR is hopefully people have played around with it before, right? You put the headset on and you get kind of transported in some way to a non-physical space, or at least a space that isn't really corresponding to the physical space that you're in. And what's aesthetically interesting about VR is that you have a sense of immersion, really, really strong immersion. So there's a sense of depth, a sense of place, a sense of three-dimensionality, when really, of course, you're just looking at some screens that are really close to your eyes. And of course, you also get works that are, well, there's a sense of interactivity. That is, you can move around in this environment or seemingly move around the environment. You can impact and change things. And finally, and this is worth noting, right? VR is what sometimes gets called disorienting, in that it doesn't help you kind of orient yourself relative to your physical environment. It's again kind of orienting you towards this virtual environment that you've moved into. And VR is contrasted with augmented reality. So AR is, to be honest, almost always done through one of these. The most famous AR application in the world by far still is Pokemon Go, which amazes me. So AR is quasi-immersive in that it's not putting you into a new space or virtual environment. It's instead kind of integrating virtual things into your physical space. Again, just kind of see the various Pokemon being somehow like as if they're on the stairs in the woods, etc. It's interactive because, again, you can kind of interact with these virtual objects via your augmented reality filter, or, right, you can sort of play around with these objects that are embedded in your physical environment. Interesting thing, again, contrasting with VR, is that it's broadly orienting in that it's augmenting your actual physical environment by incorporating these virtual entities in some way, shape, or form. And there's one more to mention, but I'm just going to flag it up and then never talk about it again, because the terminology here sometimes gets ugly, is there's a notion of MR, or mixed reality. Some people use MR as as I was talking about AR. Some people use it for a different kind of thing. The way I'm going to think about MR is basically as it's VR with pass-through. For those who don't know what pass-through is, it's where you can effectively see through your VR goggles out into the world via the little cameras that you have. So it gives you a really souped up version of augmented reality, as I characterized it. I'm not really going to talk about it, but the thing that's interesting is you kind of get, again, a sense of immersiveness and a sense of orientation, because the pass-through basically orients you to your physical environment and the virtual things involved there too. So, you still have this guy's desktop or this laptop in front of him, but now he has this huge bank of virtual monitors that are there. I'm not going to talk about MR again, but it's worth just flagging. If people are interested, we can talk a little bit about the differences there. Okay, so that's VR and AR. VR and AR as digital mediums. do a bunch of really cool things. The first thing is it's very clear that they support lots of remediation. In fact, it seems arguable that anything you could do in a kind of traditional computer monitor setup, you'll be able to do in AR and VR. So all of the remediation possibilities in the broadly digital realm can be done here. And if you look at least sort of newspapers and blog posts and things like this, a bunch of people tell you, hey, AR and VR is going to give us a whole bunch of new, amazing, exciting, novel art forms. And finally, we come back to the questions we started with, right? Are they merely remediation tools, or is the hype real? Do they actually give us new art forms? And is the hype real just because merely virtual remediation alone already gives you novel art forms? So I'm going to tackle those in turn, but in reverse. So I'm going to start with question 2. Does AR/VR remediation alone deliver novel art forms? No, I don't think so. At least not by itself. And the general thought here is fairly straightforward. It's that remediation more generally just involves a kind of change in medium as material, not medium as type or category. There's no difference in terms of category from oil painting, watercolor painting. At least as we typically understand, there isn't a difference in type between watercolor painting and digital painting, digital watercolor, if you like. There's obviously a difference in material, but this digital remediation is still maintaining the same kind of art kind or category. And the way you can kind of see this is by, again, leaning on something that Don Lopes has said, is that like virtual remediation is effectively just a kind of digital remediation. And while there are some differences, the kind broadly remains the same. And you can see this because you have a kind of ability to non-metaphorically compare digital or virtual works with their analog counterparts. You can compare a virtual painting, a painting done in VR, if it's actually presented as a kind of two-surface object, with a real physical painting. Now, of course, there's going to be differences in the production techniques. We mentioned already this kind of resistance problems about the material not actually behaving in broadly the same way, but the work type is going to be the same. And you can see it too in the sense of the kinds of aesthetic comparisons that make sense to make. You can sensibly aesthetically compare a virtual painting to an analog painting. There's some weirdness about how we engage with it, sure, but the aesthetic properties are going to be broadly the same. The kinds of features that we'll be interested in will be broadly the same. There's a comparison that isn't just mere metaphor. So I think, right, when we think about this kind of AR/VR remediation of existing art forms, it makes sense to compare any given work in the VR space of the relevant category to any given analog work of the relevant category. It's sensible, I think, to compare virtual painting with analog painting. Now, note, there's still plenty of room here to compare differences, but that's already true when we think about just other forms, right? You can compare the differences in watercolor and oil and appreciate how hard it is to get this very soft, kind of gentle look, maybe oil painting. That's so much easier with the kind of medium here and material versus watercolor. And you could do the same thing if you wanted to talk about with a digital brush. And to really drive it home, I think that there's something like the same broad creation skills required for these virtual instances or these digital instances, and there's same broad appreciation skills required if you're going to engage with the work in the appropriate kind of way. So an easy one when we think about the appreciation skills, digital sculpture appreciation and analog sculpture appreciation are broadly going to be the same kinds of activities. You want to walk around the object or move around the object. You want to think about how it fits in the space it's being presented in, if it's being presented in an appropriate kind of space. You want to think about the material involved, which, cool, there's different kinds of materialities, but that doesn't really impact the broad category of being a sculpture. And the same things about dynamic versus static. We're going to highlight the same basic features to give us whether the sculpture, digital or analog, is a dynamic sculpture. Again, these aren't metaphorical comparisons, they're genuine comparisons. Genuine comparisons. So, and I think this is borne out in examples. Virtual cinema is still a kind of cinema. Virtual painting is broadly the same kind of painting. Again, setting aside the sort of worries about material resistance. Virtual sculpture, I think, again, is a kind of sculpture, though much easier. And virtual dance is an interesting one because arguably virtual dance might just be a kind of dance, just being displayed using image capture technology. But put a pin in that because we'll come back to it. So the upshot of all of this is remediation alone doesn't give us new art kinds, which is nice. That at least makes the other question harder. So virtual remediation told us, right, we've got old wine in virtual bottles, but do we get any new vintages, right? Is there something actually novel here? Are AR and VR merely remediation tools, or do they actually give us genuinely novel art forms? And I think it's worth noting what really is kind of required for us to get a novel virtual art form. We're going to have novel production and appreciation skills, because otherwise it looks like it's just going to be an instance of remediation. And there needs to be a kind of breakdown of this cross-medium comparison, the kind of thing that was referenced in the Lopes quote earlier, or the kind of idea of like, look, you can compare any digital film with any analog film and at least broadly track the same aesthetic properties. So cool. That's actually pretty hard already. But the other thing to note is that if we really want something genuinely novel, it's going to turn out to be even more difficult than that sets out. Because what kind of form should we be looking for here? What kind of art type or kind or art form? Well, one that sort of jumps out is an art form that's been instanced in augmented and virtual reality, but not in meat space yet. So we've done it in VR, but we haven't done this in physical space. And that's kind of an initial good place to start. But I think that's too weak as well. And that's too weak as well because any art form that's possible to instance in physical space, in kind of analog physical space, but happens to merely be first done in AR and VR, is going to be what we might call pre-remediation, to really just abuse language for a second. But what I mean by this is it's effectively a kind of remediation of a medium, a possibly physical medium that just hasn't been instanced yet. Another way to get at this, right? Imagine per impossible that we would have come up with digital photography first. I don't think that makes photography into a uniquely digital art form. It's still a broadly physical or digital art form. So if we want to find something genuinely novel, it's going to be something that's not possible to do with analog tools. Not possible to do without using AR and VR. And it's really worth emphasizing how kind of hard that is. That really eliminates kind of almost everything that we might think of. Because if it's possible to do in meat space with physical analog art making tools, then it's not going to be genuinely novel here. It's going to be, again, to jokingly call it pre-remediation, even if we've just never done it yet. So it's got to be an art form that can only be realized in AR and VR. And here's a wild shot about art forms that could be like that. It's going to be nomically impossible art. That is, art, the production and appreciation of which necessarily involves violating the laws of physics. Now, notably, we also want to avoid kind of conceptual art here because that, sure, could be nomically impossible. So it does need to be non-conceptual, but we can put that aside. So it's some kind of art form that the production and appreciation of which is just simply not physically possible in a non-virtual or augmentedly virtual environment. And I've got an example with VR, and I really like it. I've seen a few instances of it, though I haven't really seen a lot of cases yet. And I've called it plunge paintings. And you can see a kind of instance of it going on here. And a dream brush, it's a three-dimensional digital painting, or kind of somewhere in between painting and sculpture. And the creation process involves building layers in a way where you actually build inside layers and outside layers kind of simultaneously or as you go. And the appreciation requires that you actually not just look at the surface, but move inside the painting. So for example, in a later part of the same video here, Anna finishes this picture, and then the way you're meant to appreciate it, it's this woman looking quite pensive, and then as you move in, you kind of move inside her head, and you get a kind of video of this incident she had with somebody else, and that's why she's nervous or anxious about. And of course, right, the whole appreciation involves not just kind of, hey, here's the surface image, and here's the thing that she's being anxious about, because we could capture that with cinema or even with comic books or something like this. But the actual overall work is this sort of three-dimensional environment sculpture picture that you move in and out and engage with in this, again, almost like engaging with sculpture kind of way. It's interactive, it's immersive, and it's physically impossible because as far as I know, you can't move through walls and stuff like that. This is why you couldn't do this, say, with like a 3D pen, because it would be a one-time use kind of moving through. So this looks like something that is engendered by VR. It's only engendered by VR. I don't really see, at least prima facie, we'll come back to a worry in a moment, but this could not be instanced in a non-virtual medium, certainly not in a kind of physical way. So plunge painting production involves elements that are absent in traditional virtual painting or virtual sculpture. You've got to think about how the layers overlap, what layers will look like from the inside, how to use this sort of layering to convey stories and draw appreciation. Similarly, appreciating these works involves engaging in ways that you don't usually do, even with standard virtual painting, because again, it's thinking about the layering, it's thinking about what happens when you move through layers, considering the interplay and overlapping, these sorts of things that are just simply absent if you're thinking about traditional paintings, even virtual remediated versions thereof. And finally, again, to lean back on this sort of comparison point, I think you could draw comparisons between plunge paintings and traditional, even virtual paintings, but those are going to be broadly superficial or metaphorical. So that seems to me like a genuinely novel art form. How about AR? Well, here's the case for AR, and I'm really dodgy on this one, but spot me and let me know what you think. So when it comes to AR, I think we again want to try and find a case where it's a nomically impossible work. Because otherwise, again, it's going to be a form of pre-remediation. And the thought here is that we might be able to get it by what I've called dual occupancy dances. Or could also think about this as a kind of moving sculpture. And the idea is that using your AR device, so your phone, what you're supposed to do is look through your phone with one eye and look with your regular eye, the same place. And through that, you get a kind of overlay of a virtual object and a physical object. So a physical dancer and an avatar moving in augmented reality space. And the artwork isn't going to be just the physical person's movement or just the avatar's movement, but it's actually the kind of two put together, almost like a pairing. But importantly, in this case, we want the things to literally occupy the same physical space, or at least seem to occupy the same physical space. And the appreciation here isn't going to be merely on how the avatar moves or how the individual moves, but it's also thinking about how the occupants engage with each other in the same place at the same time. Now, this is super abstract because I haven't really run across anyone making a work like this. I've talked to some people in Antwerp about instances, but I haven't seen anybody who's actually done it yet, at least not where it's interesting. um, but I want to say the same thing that I said about plunge painting. I think the production here is going to be different than traditional dance or even remediated dance into the VR space, because the way you'll need to think about it as a maker is going to be playing off this kind of physical impossibility of laying the virtual and the physical object at the same place at the same time. I think that also, again, your ways of engaging here are going to require you to think about this as like these two objects occupying the same space. And we can make comparisons here, but again, these comparisons are going to be, in the same way with the plunge paintings, kind of metaphorical at best. So what do these two kinds of art forms suggest? Well, I think actually AR and VR really do enable novel art forms. AR and VR isn't just old wine in new bottles, but there's potential for some novel vintages here too. And of course, I don't want to say that these two are the only kind of novel virtual art forms. I'm very interested what virtual artists can come up with. But the thing to remember is whatever we're going to make, whatever they're going to make, if it's going to be a genuinely novel art form, then it can't be something that we could, that's a kind of instance of pre-remediation. And that leads me to the objection. And this will be the last kind of substantive thing to really talk about. And the objection is, I think it's going to turn out that these aren't actually exclusive to VR and AR. The lurking problem is that they can be instanced in a kind of non-virtual setup. Put another way, they can be instanced on basically the wrong platforms. So it's really easy to get a version of plunge painting going, not in VR. Let's just use a computer and a monitor. And we can scroll with our mouse button to move in and out of the painting and mouse around to get a look. This certainly seems to give users basically the same affordances to engage with these works. It gives artists the same broad creative tools. It's not going to be as easy, but it's still going to basically be there. Right? So it looks like you can have non-virtual plunge paintings using old style computers and monitors. And the same thing with digital occupancy dance, right? We could do this using traditional computer monitor. If we really want to make it in the kind of way that I suggested, like let's imagine that this webcam is just pointed the other way and it's giving me half is the person and half is the avatar. And again, it's giving me effectively a film input or like a video input of what I would see if I was using AR. This looks like, again, a non kind of headset-y version of these things. If those are right, and if those are really instances of plunge painting and dual occupancy dance, then all that novel stuff just goes out the window. And that's kind of bad, which is, crap. More generally, it seems like any kind of nomically impossible art we could make in a old style computer monitor setup in a non-VR or non-virtual way. Traditional video games gives us plenty of nomically impossible instances, interactive environments. It should note, I have the little aside here about it being interactive, just to kind of say, look, merely describing it in a novel or a written fiction isn't going to quite get what we want. It needs to be interactive and immersive in some ways and blah, blah, blah. Um, but browser-based installations certainly will capture it. Various forms of web art are going to capture it. Put really bluntly, it seems like if you can do it in AR, VR, then you can do it in other non-virtual digital media too. And I think there's kind of two ways to go here. And it's a fun choice point. And it's a choice point about how unique we want the term virtual to be. So this is kind of a connection back with the debate I mentioned way back at the top with the ontology of AR and VR. So some people, like Dave Chalmers, I think, want to say AR and VR are fundamentally different than video games, than the kind of virtual worlds, and scare quotes there, that you might engage with on your computer and your monitor. If you think there's a genuine separation there between things like video games and AR and VR, then I think the kind of things that I was just saying seem to undercut the notion that AR and VR give us novel art forms. But you could also, and I like this, I think this is a feature, not a bug. You could say what this shows is that actually the notion of virtual that we're talking about with VR and AR is picking out a whole lot more than what we might have thought. So traditional monitor and computer systems were already giving us a kind of VR. That's just not strapped up to your face VR. It's slightly at arm's distance where we use our keyboard and mouse, and it's a hell of a lot cheaper than one of those things you slap on your face, right? This would still give us novelty in some sense, but it really kind of turns it into something more like the novelty we got when we moved to the digital really flatly. And if that's also what we meant when we used the term virtual, that it ranges over things like video game systems and computers plugged into monitors and stuff, then it looks like we could have already answered our question about novel art forms with video games. So there's a kind of lurking difficulty here in some ways, a tension, I suppose. To get genuine novelty, you have to have something that's not going to turn out to be pre-remediated. But if it's something that's not pre-remediated, it's going to be something you could do on non-VR computer systems. So either then you include those in the VR aspects too, or you give up on this novelty. I'm quite happy to say, yeah, that turns out to be virtual stuff too. But that makes some things like Chalmers's realism a little bit less attractive, because it means that you've got to be a realist about Mario in a way that I think Dave doesn't want to be. Okay, so wrapping up. Sorry, I've been babbling at you for a while. So where to go from here? What have we done? Well, I started off the really long run up by talking to you again about like kind of digital technology allows for the remediation of lots of art types, of art forms, and it supports, it seems, novel digital-only art kinds. Then I started pivoting to thinking about AR and VR specifically. Right? And here it's pretty clear that it allows for remediation, basically everything that other digital technologies would do, but was also kind of interested in whether it delivers something specific, VR specific or AR specific novel art forms. And there I tried to argue that virtual remediation alone doesn't deliver novel art kinds or forms, but there do seem to be ones in these kind of nomically impossible interactive arts things like plunge paintings and things like oh, and things like this sort of multiple occupancy or dual occupancy dances. But the problem is that if they're really going to be genuinely novel, and that requires exclusivity, then I'm not even sure that these ones are going to turn out to be like genuinely novel. They're going to be remediated just simply from, in this case, video games or something like it. So yeah, I think that's kind of me done. Thank you guys very much for listening. I hope that was interesting, and I very much look forward to your questions.